My name is Vicky Joshi. I'm a physiotherapist and a researcher at the University of Southern Denmark, and I'm employed by the Danish Knowledge Centre for Rehabilitation and Palliative Care. I'm going to talk today about the research project that we have in Denmark on rehabilitation support for survivors and families after cardiac arrest. I'm going to talk a little bit about the DANCAS project, about the user involvement workshop that we had at the beginning of the project, about, as part of the DANCAS project, the rehabilitation course for survivors and relatives that we have in Denmark, and then finish with some thoughts and information on the next steps in the project. So a little bit of background first. The population of Denmark is almost 6 million. People that have a cardiac arrest, at the moment around 16% of people survive to a hospital discharge, and that's increasing every year. And it means that we have around 800 survivors every year in Denmark. However, there's no specific rehabilitation support after cardiac arrest for survivors or their relatives. On this basis, we started in 2018 the Danish Cardiac Arrest Survivorship Network, or DANCAS Network, and the DANCAS project, with the aim of improving life after cardiac arrest for survivors and relatives through rehabilitation support. We started in November 2018 with a user involvement workshop where we invited survivors, relatives, clinicians with experience of cardiac arrest survivors and researchers to come and talk about their experiences, their stories of cardiac arrest, the rehabilitation they received, what they would have liked to have received, what they think was missing. And from this, there were lots of different results, but I've just chosen two to talk about here. The first was a need for assessment tools that can identify problems early on after surviving a cardiac arrest, either in hospital or not too long after discharge home again. We know that if problems can be identified early and people are offered tailored rehabilitation, that it's less likely that these problems will become chronic. Also identified was a lack of rehabilitation support for survivors, particularly on the non-cardiac problems. So cognitive problems, so problems of thinking, memory, maybe how that affects returning to work or family life. The problems of mental health, for example, anxiety and depression, and also fatigue was discussed by a lot of people, and understanding the fatigue after cardiac arrest and getting some advice and support with that. On this basis, we decided to set up a rehabilitation course for survivors after cardiac arrest. The course is based in Nyborg in the centre of Denmark. It's at a clinical site that where people can stay overnight. It's residential. Different courses are run there for people with life-limiting or life-threatening health conditions, for example, cancer. And this course that we set up there was specifically for survivors of cardiac arrest, for those that had self-identified rehabilitation needs. People needed to be around 6 months after cardiac arrest, a minimum of 3 months, but people could be up to a year or 2 or 3 years after their cardiac arrest. They needed to be self-caring, so generally living at home and able to look after themselves when they came on the course. They could attend with or without a relative. A majority of people came with a relative, but the course was set up for either. And as I say, it's a residential course, so people needed to be able to come and stay overnight for the duration of the course. The course is comprehensive in nature, so we have different components. Cognitive testing as part of the course with a neuropsychologist, a short battery of tests taking around 30 minutes, and participants receive the results of their individual tests as part of the course. But what we don't offer is cognitive rehabilitation. There are sessions on the psychological impact of cardiac arrest, the existential side. We have a session with a priest. Peer support is really important, so there's lots of opportunity to talk to other survivors, to hear their stories, and also to think and discuss all the information that people are receiving on the course. Many survivors won't have met another cardiac arrest survivor before, so it's this group element is really important. We talk about active rest, and participants take part in sessions on yoga and mindfulness, all part of managing perhaps their mental health, and also managing fatigue as well. We talk about energy conservation, we talk about sleep hygiene, again as part of managing fatigue. And physical activity is discussed. We do some exercise tests so people have an idea of their fitness level, and we introduce them to an exercise diary that they can complete in between the two parts of the course. There's a couple of voluntary sessions, so people can choose if they would like to, perhaps if they're at working age, they would like to talk about going back to work, talking to the job centres in Denmark, and what some of the challenges to that might be, or where they can get support. And also family life, if they have children that have been perhaps affected by the cardiac arrest, we talk about that as well. Relatives can attend the session, can attend the course. We don't have specific elements for the relatives, they're seen more as the support for the survivors. But there's also sessions just for the relatives that are facilitated to allow them to meet together and talk. Just a little bit about the organisation of the course. It begins with a 5-day stay, then 12 weeks in between. Participants receive a telephone call from one of the clinicians to talk about perhaps the problems that they identified on the first part of the course and how they're going with some of the solutions and ideas from the course. They also have an information book with all of the information in, and they have an exercise training diary as well that they can fill in if they wish. We then have another 2-day follow-up that recaps some of the information from the 5-day course. We redo the exercise tests, so if people have been particularly focused on improving their fitness level, they can look to see whether there's a difference. And there's an opportunity for the survivors to get together and the relatives to talk about the last 3 months and what they found useful and perhaps the solutions they found to some of the problems they identified on the first course. So, thinking about the next steps in the project, the current rehab course will finish at the end of 2020. It's a pilot study, so we will look at all of the results, we'll look at the feedback from the survivors, the participants, the relatives, and also the clinicians that have run the course as well, and make some decisions on whether we want to change the course, whether we want to do it differently, whether we think it's achieving the aims that we set out to. Once we've made some decisions on that, we will then look at another research project maybe to test the effectiveness of the rehabilitation course. Other parts of the DANCAS project, which are going on at the moment and into the future, will be the development of screening and assessment tools, so identifying ways of screening for problems early on after cardiac arrest. There's different ways of doing these things. One suggestion, one project will be to look at cognitive screening using electronic devices, for example an iPad, which might indicate or help identify the people that would benefit from more in-depth neuropsychological testing or more cognitive rehabilitation. We would also like to develop some interventions that are specific to the relatives, so that's one project that's happening. And also to raise awareness of post-cardiac arrest consequences. So this might be as part of information for survivors and relatives after their cardiac arrest, but also it's really important that this information is received by health professionals as well. And that might be health professionals in the hospital, in general practice, or it might be as part of cardiac rehabilitation where cardiac arrest survivors are taking part in cardiac rehab, and it's important that healthcare staff are aware that there's the potential for perhaps mental health problems or emotional problems or cognitive problems. So that's another part of the DANCAS project. I'm going to finish my presentation there. I'd just like to say a special thanks to the DANCAS network, to the clinical research team at REPA, and also to all the survivors and relatives who've taken part in the youth involvement activities, the research and the rehab course so far. There's just some references there if you would like to read more on what I talked about today. And the contact details if you would like to find out more about the course or the Dancast network or the Dancast project. Thank you very much for listening.